Hello everyone, and in this video lesson, this video lecture, we're going to focus on the main topic we have for task 2.1, which is building the needs analysis instrument. Now, this is very important to identify that this is not about implementing the instrument at this specific moment in time, but more importantly, figuring out how to approach the writing of the questionnaire, the questions, what to focus on, what to omit, and in a general sense, what sort of techniques or segments of information should we focus on in order to achieve a good quality and valuable instrument. Because the better your instrument is, the better the quality of the information that you're going to gather, and in turn that will inform in a much higher quality the sort of curriculum and syllabus that you will be able to develop for your ESP course. Okay, so with that introduction, let's move on to the next slide here to start getting into the topic for this video lecture. Let's take a quick moment here to remember the importance of a needs analysis process within the ESP course format. Now, one of the core elements, one of the principal elements would be here as displayed here on screen, which is the core. It's the core of ESP course design. Unlike the EGP, here we need to go back to that idea where an English for General Purposes course is focused on the broader idea, just created for a general audience with no specific intention in mind other than just learning English for individual and personal goals like shopping online, going to the movies and understanding the movie or understanding a song, general things that happen in the day-to-day life. Here, what we need to focus on is targeted, specific skills within an occupational or academic environment. So, in order to do that, the needs analysis is core, is fundamental, it is essential. In addition to that, also, we need to remember here that a needs analysis helps us to identify the target needs, the current abilities that students, or in other words, the employees or the students or people in the academia, the skills that they currently have, and the gaps that they have. We're going to take a look at that in a few more slides. Here, what I'd like to recall is Woodrow here explains that ESP always begins with learners, what they need to do in their specific context, what they can already do, and where those gaps are. So here, in order to properly build an ESP course, you need to identify those three components, and your course, your ESP course, is going to target specifically those gaps. So there's a way to do this in order to bring those out, to emerge those gaps in order for you to actually know what to focus on your ESP course on. And also, a proper needs analysis helps us to ensure relevance to the learner's real context. This is kind of going back to the first idea here, where if you're not really doing the work, paying attention to really narrowing down all of the activities, the contents, and the skills into the employees or the academia person, into their context, then you're risking the situation of creating not an ESP course but an EGP course, because it'll be broad, it'll be general, it will not have a direct link to your students' immediate context, and that is essential for what constitutes an ESP course. So here we have these three core ideas to keep in mind as we move forward here, and just keep those in mind. Needs analysis is so important for your ESP course for these reasons, mainly among other ones. And with that said, let's move on here to our next idea. Creating a needs analysis instrument for an ESP course is not just about listing a series of questions in a random way or to address topics and issues that you consider are relevant in English as a whole. Because if that were the case, then we're talking not about an ESP course, but actually about an EGP course, an English for General Purposes course. In order to narrow down to be specific about the necessities that the students have, again, we're talking about EOP or EAP, we need to focus and we need to take into account three core components. The first one, and I'll list them out here first, and then we'll address each one. So the first one is the Target Situation Analysis, or TSA. The second is Present Situation Analysis, or PSA. And lastly, the Learner Lacks. Okay, let's go one by one here. So to begin with, the Target Situation Analysis is, in a sense, talking about what they must do with the English. So there's a target, there's an expectation on behalf of the employer, there's an expectation perhaps on behalf of the educational institution, like this is what these people need to do. Now usually that information you're going to find perhaps in a job description, in a student profile, some sort of documentation that tells you this is what they need to do. Regardless, it is important that you include that information or questions about the TSA, the Target Situation Analysis, within the questions of your needs analysis so that you directly ask them, because it is important to know, for you to know, if they are aware of that target situation or not. And that will put you in the position of knowing exactly how to approach this. Also, you can interview or apply this instrument to the employer or the general manager or a supervisor, because they should have that information off the top of their head, so they are also able to answer those questions for you. Now, the second one here, the Present Situation Analysis, or PSA, this is what they currently do. Here you just need to tell them or ask them more precisely, okay, what do you do? What do you currently do? What are you able to do currently, depending on whatever it is you need to talk about? Is it about writing an email? Is it about taking notes during a meeting? Is it about talking on the phone with potential clients or providers? I don't know. It really depends on what the functional or social or job related activity is, but it is important that in a series of questions, you ask what it is you currently do and to what degree do you consider yourself. So there's a bit of self-evaluation in these sort of questions, because it's not about just what you do, because then they're going to say, well, I write emails. Well, that's fine, but that's not going to give you the information that you need. You need to have a self-evaluation built into the question. Like you could either ask like an open question of how do you evaluate yourself when writing emails, for example, or give a Likert scale, like on a scale of 1 to 5, how good or how bad or whatever it is, do you write emails? That sort of element, because that's going to give you the information that you need to actually assess the present situation analysis of PSA. And lastly, this is really not something that's going to be, although it can be, you can put questions about the learner lacks. Again, that's sort of a self-evaluation, but for the most part, even though you put questions that address learner lacks, it's really about you taking the target analysis, the target situation analysis, the present situation analysis, and then finding what the differences are. So if you have a specific description for what an employee needs to do when writing an email, and then in the present situation analysis, they tell you, well, I can only do it to this far, and you identify there's a series of skills and language and vocabulary and expressions that they're missing, that's the learner gap right there. And that's what you focus your ESP course on. You can make questions, of course, and include these in your questionnaire, but mostly what you will be doing is using your analyses to figure this out. And once you do that, once you get that specific list, like these are the gaps that I've identified, then now in a pretty good measure, you have the outline for what is to be your ESP course. Pretty much that's it. But in essence, your needs analysis for any ESP course needs to include your TSA, your PSA, and your learner lag questions. It needs to cover all three. And then after that, once you get the information, then you get into the analysis to actually get those gaps. Alrighty, let's move on here to identify the various ways that you can collect information from your students, employers, or academic people that will potentially be your students. As you're building your needs analysis process and you're getting ready to eventually gather data, gather information from the people that will eventually be your students, it is not just important to identify, well, the TSA, PSA, and the lags, but also the different collection methods that you have available to you. Now, here I'm just listing for them. There may be others, of course, but let's say these are the principal ones. Also, another interesting point to take into consideration here is that it really depends what you're after, because different methods of gathering data will yield different insights. For example, a questionnaire is generally a closed sort of question listing. You'll have your yes and no questions, you'll have your Likert questions, you can even have like statements and then have like a table with different values. But all of this is really closed. So it's yielding a series of data that you can quantify and create graphics. So that's going to give you a very specific set of insights with regard to what you're after, for example. So it's generally very broad in essence. But if you're looking, let's say, for a lot more depth, that you really want to do a deep dive into exactly what is the experience of these people, then perhaps a questionnaire is much better, where you sit with on a one-to-one situation. You have, let's say, a series of open questions that you have prepared. And it's always, when you do interviews, it's always also a good idea to have an audio recorder. Nowadays, you can use your phone and audio record the interview, because then you can instead focus on the conversation during that interview, and then later you can take the notes. That's usually a much better way of doing it. But that, again, that gives you depth, that gives you real insight into exactly what the experience is, and then that will in turn give you a lot more information with regard to what are the gaps, what are the lags, and what you need to focus on when preparing your ESP course. Observations is another great way to get depth, because to get depth with regard to performance, because now you're not talking to anybody, you're not asking for information, you're just sitting in a corner observing. Maybe you have a format or some kind of questionnaire that you're filling out, but you're observing actual performance. So it's not people telling you what they perceive they have to do or what they perceive that they can do. Now you're actually observing that performance. And maybe that's what you need in order to prepare your ESP course for this specific situation or scenario that you may have selected or that you are hired to observe and analyze in order to do that ESP course. Also, you can do tests and self-assessment evaluations to actually see the other side of that performance. Now here, it's not just about creating like a question like, do you know English? Do you know the adjectives and the verbs and that sort of thing? But your questions for self-assessment here have to reflect what they actually do. So if your employer, if the person that's hiring you is telling you, well, I need my people to write better emails, then have them do a self-assessment where the activity is to write an email. So you're not just observing now, you're actually getting the product of what they do. And that is something else that you can analyze to get even further, a further deep dive into exactly what is happening here. Now, that's just one example. This could be also applied for any other situation that is needed and required for the ESP course that you anticipate on developing. So, data collection tools, it is important to identify what they are, most importantly because you have to know what it is you plan to get out of it. Again, the sort of question and the sort of data collection method is going to give you a very specific set of answers, of information, and the quality of that information is really going to help you get a high quality course. If you have low quality information, in other words, it's very general, it doesn't really tell you the actual experience, that then your ESP course will seem like it's a hit or miss, like you're guessing in the dark, and you really don't want to do that. So for these reasons, it is so important to actually dedicate the time and take a little more time if necessary to develop a good and congruent needs analysis instrument to get all of these elements into place. And then when you actually implement it, you know it's going to work for the purposes and the benefits that you need. And then that will help you to further your exercise of needs analysis. Righty. Let's move on here to some key design principles in the following slides. All right, let's take a look at 4 key design principles for actually writing the questions and statements that you may include in your needs analysis instrument. And the first key design principle here that we have is to keep your questions clear and concise. So, in other words, you want to avoid these extremely long questions that just have clauses within clauses within clauses. It's just going to confuse the other person. The more clear and the concise, but with the necessary information in order for the person who is answering to understand what the question is about, the better information you're going to get. So it's really a point of finding the balance. You don't want a question that's too long because it's going to be confusing. But again, you don't want a question that's too short because then it's not going to have the necessary information. It should reflect and ask about the specific topic for the specific information that you want to extract in a clear way. So really important to focus on the sort of writing, the sort of grammar that you're using in your questions so that you know that the people that are going to be answering your questionnaire, your needs analysis instrument, will clearly understand and in turn give you the information that you're looking for. As you're writing your questions, your key design principle number 2 is to identify both closed and open-ended questions. Very similar to the methods that you may use to gather information, understanding that depending on the method, there are different insights to be had. Same is the case for the sort of questions, closed and opened. So, for example, closed questions will normally give you information that is measurable. In other words, quantitative data that you can quantify, create graphics, tables, count, in other words, for different reasons and depending on the different formats of closed questions that you may use. On the other hand, open-ended questions are going to give you more nuanced responses, because now you're allowing the person to freely write an answer, no matter how short or long that person may write it. So you're actually going to get a lot more profound and nuanced and more specified information from that sort of answer. It'll be a little more difficult to graph, but it's a qualitative value that you're going to get. So it is important that you include these two types of questions in your needs analysis instrument. They may have different ways of being presented, but nonetheless, both are important within the same instrument. A third principle for you to consider when designing your questions, when writing them, and here more specifically organizing them within the sheet that's going to be your needs analysis instrument, is to organize them by these three core principles: the TSA, the PSA, and the LACS. Again, the target situation analysis, the present situation analysis, and the learner gaps. Now, it's not really, or let's say the purpose of the instrument is not to confuse anybody. So it is important, or it is valuable, to have some sort of expectation. In other words, like to have a story, that you know that a story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. In that same light, you could organize potentially your questions starting from the target situation, then the present situation, and then the gaps. So that way you have a sort of story that you're following. Or you could also organize them into from present situation, target situation, and gaps. Or you could start at gaps. It doesn't really matter. What's more important is that you include cues that are clearly telling the interviewee what you're focusing on. Not that you're telling him or her the concept as we have it here, like TSA, PSA, and LACS, but that you're asking, okay, these following 3 or 4 questions are about what you actually do. Okay, now this next section is about what is expected from you based on your job description. Okay, this is what you feel that, so you see what I'm getting at there? It's like you're telling and then you're grouping those questions there. That way it helps for you to contextualize your interview, and really there's not supposed to be any surprises. You actually want them to be truthful, so you need to provide an instrument that is perhaps predictable and has a clear expectation of what you want. And that's really going to help you in the process of getting that information. Our fourth and final key design principle we have here for actually writing the questions is to try and focus on a list of questions of somewhere between 5 and 10 questions. I would generally recommend to round it out, if not at 5, at 10 questions, but maybe not somewhere in the middle there, like 7, 8, or 9, or 6. There's something about rounding out the numbers to 10 that people have that sort of expectation. You may attribute it to educational purposes, like we come from an educational system where we strive, or it educates us to strive to get a number 10. In the educational context, like elementary, secondary, and high school, it's a grade. Aspire to get the 10 in everything that you do. So that creates a sort of culture, because that sort of expectation, or that striving towards a 10, is transferred to everything else. So whenever you get like a questionnaire that has a 7 or 8 questions, you're kind of left with like a little bit of emptiness, like there's something missing, but I did it. Whereas if you write 10 specific questions, then that sort of thing is satisfied as well. I mean, that's just a broad recommendation, but in general sense, to get 5 to 10 questions is a good amount. Like setting the number of questions really depends on how much information you need. If you're aware of the context, if you know the context, then perhaps 5 questions is better. If you really don't know the context, then maybe you will be trying to achieve those 10 questions. What you really don't want to do is get like this extremely long document with 30, 40, 50 questions, because you're just going to tire your potential students, and they haven't even started your course. So you want something brief, short, and in turn, that's also going to force you to really think about the context, the situations, and the information, the key information that you need to extract, and that's going to like take you a very long way in the design process of your ESP course. Okay, let's take a look at some quick examples for each of the TSA, PSA, and LACs. Now, what we have here is one example for the target situation analysis, where you ask, for example, what English tasks do you perform daily in your job? Notice that this sort of question is bringing together two situations. One is the person's job, what he or she does normally, and this related to the performance in English. So there's this element of self-evaluation implied or built into this sort of question. So these are the sort of questions that you want to aim for, where you cover the different aspects. Okay, let's move on here to the next example we have. And here we have an example question, or a sample question for a PSA item, a present situation analysis. And the question here reads, how confident are you when writing work emails in English? Again, notice that element of talking about what you do in the language, but also what you do with the language in your job context. So very specific question, very simply written, and really the person actually knows what to answer. And in this case, we're talking about what you currently do. So let's move on here to the last example question that we have. And this final example here focuses on the learner lags, where it reads, which skills do you most need to improve? Now, this has a really good like self-evaluation element when organized in a very specific way. Like, for example, if you first set up the TSA questions and the PSA questions, by the time you get or not you, but your interviewee, he or she gets to these questions, you're indicating to that person, like, okay, look at it, what you've answered so far. What do you perceive to be those gaps? And that's going to give you some insights. You may include a specific list from which to select if you already have that, or you can just leave it open and then have those people give you those options. It really depends. So organization here on how you organize is also going to affect the sort of format you're going to have for your questions, which is one of those key design principles that I was previously talking about. Okay, just some ideas, some examples to consider to guide you in that process. Okay, let's move on here towards the end of our video lecture. Okay, so far we've looked at everything that we need to do. What are some core ideas, key design principles, and generally speaking, some good recommendations. So in an opposite way, let's look at some of the things we're not supposed to do. Because we may inadvertently, as we're designing our needs analysis instrument, we may fall onto these traps. So to begin with, one thing that is very important to avoid is just in general to ask general English questions. Like, for example, do you like English? Like, that would be a sort of question that you definitely do not want to include in your needs analysis instrument, because this is not about them liking or not, or if they know a specific verb conjugation. It's really about doing, or more so performing, in a job situation, language skills, or in an academic situation. So forego all of those sort of questions and really just focus on the target situation, the job and the academic situation, depending on what you're doing your course on. Another idea here is writing overly broad or unclear questions. So again, going back to this idea of making these sort of questions that are just too complicated or just too brief, and by being brief, they tend to be very broad. So it's really a matter of finding what is the right balance, something more or less in the middle there, where it's easy, it's clear to understand, and it really leads the person to writing the information that you actually need in order for you to continue on doing your ESP course. So really important stuff. Also, if you fall into these traps, then you're also very potentially not doing an ESP course, but in fact doing an EGP course. Very important. It's something that you continually need to be monitoring. Also, ignoring learner context. If you don't take into consideration the necessities and the performance that is expected within the job or occupational field or situation that you're analyzing, or academic as well, the moment you stop doing that, then you're not doing an ESP course. You're doing an EGP course. So continuously, you need to be monitoring that everything you do is in some way or another tied to the learner context. It has to be. It has to be for it to be an ESP course. The moment it's not, then you're not doing an ESP course. Lastly here, designing too many questions. I was talking about this before. An instrument that has 30, 40, 50 questions is just not viable. It's just not something that, just because so many things are important, you need to include everything. Really, you need to just prioritize what are the key fundamental items, and then everything else you're going to logically extract. But that's an analysis you need to do after the fact, not in the needs analysis instrument, which is what people are going to be answering. So really important to really think about what topics you're going to focus on, how you're going to write those questions, and what sort of presentation they're going to have, like open-ended, closed, Likert, tables, like scales. Like use those combination of methods in order to get the best possible results. And also look at those key design principles, look at the TSA, PSA, and LACs. Use all of these components to not just do a needs analysis that seems random, like, or hit or miss, but really specific, really focuses and targets a very key element of a job or academic situation, and you're really getting that information that you need. Okay, let's move on here to the almost final slide. And before we wrap up this video lecture, I do just want to come back to the idea of the design, of designing the needs analysis instrument, because it's really, really important to take the time to think about what it's about, what you're doing, how you're building it, how you're designing it, and in turn, then have a successful implementation. Think of it in this way. Now here I have, yes, the instrument shapes the quality of the data collected, and I've mentioned this throughout this video lecture. Another way of looking at this is that the instrument, not the questions that you write, but the instrument as a whole is a filter through which information you're going to be gathering. So it's your filter. You're actually doing your filter. So everything you put, or the way you design your instrument, is in fact your filter. Everything that is not included there is going to be omitted. And that's a good thing. So you intentionally want to omit certain information, certain answers, and you intentionally want to include these other bits of information that are actually important for you as a course, as an ESP course designer. So that's really important to take into consideration. Also, a well-crafted item reveals precise learner information. Again, it's really about writing those questions in the best way possible, because the better stated your question is, the better it's actually going to reflect the reality of your learner. And the better it is reflected, that reality, the better then the ESP course is going to be designed and implemented. And you're just going to get a lot of really happy learners at the end of your course, because they're going to feel that their needs were in fact met by the course that you designed. In other words, or in an opposite situation here, a poorly structured instrument will just leave so many more questions, so many more gaps than the ones that you found to begin with. And that is definitely something you don't want to do. So again, really focusing on those questions, that they're really well crafted, well written, not too obtuse, not too simplified, just somewhere in the middle there. As we say here, the Goldilocks effect, like not too hot, not too cold, just right. And lastly here, a poor design leads to vague or unusable results. Once again, kind of going back to this idea. Another way of looking at this with regards to results. As you're writing your questions, in a way, you have to also envision the sort of answers you're going to get, because that way it kind of tells you how you're going to process that information. So notice how then, by writing the right sort of question, I already know how I'm going to process the information. So if you're going to do like a closed sort of question, then you know that you're going to get information in a very specific way. Let's say it's a Likert scale. So you know, or you can ask yourself, okay, how am I going to process these 5 options that I'm giving to this learner? How am I going to graph it? How am I going to analyze it? And you haven't done it yet, but you're just writing the question, and you have to be thinking about those sort of things. Okay, here I have an open-ended question. Okay, so I'm going to get this broad scope of answers. How am I going to categorize? How am I going to segment? How am I going to extract the nuance that I need for my ESP course design? And then how am I going to relate and contrast and analyze that information? So notice in the process of writing that open-ended question, you're already thinking about having that expectation of what sort of answers you may be getting and how you're going to be processing that information. That's what this means about poor design leads to vague or unusable results, because you need to think about the whole process, not just writing the question and then see what happens. It's like I'm writing the questions because these are the sort of forms, not the exact or specific words, but the form of the answer. And then this is how I'm going to process that information to get the analysis that I need to inform me in order to do a good job at doing this ESP course design. So really important, design matters when you're doing an ESP course. I would argue to say that it matters 10 times, 20 times, 50 times more than when doing an EGB course. Really take the time, really focus on writing down your questions, thinking about not just the question of how you write it, but the whole process of the person answering, the sort of answers you're going to get and how you're going to process and analyze that information. That's the whole process. And that's more or less up to there. Once you get that information, then you're in the position of getting those insights and then leading you in to the process of the actual outline of the curriculum, the syllabus. But that is a topic for a different video lecture, for a different situation, not for this one in specific. Okay, let's move on here towards the end of this video lecture and just kind of wrap it up with some concluding ideas. Okay, so we've come to the end of this video lecture on building the needs analysis instrument. And as we wrap this up, I just want to leave you with 4 ideas, just to kind of summarize and surmise everything that we've covered in this video lecture. To begin with, the first one here, question design directly impacts course outcomes. So again, so important to really focus on writing the best possible questions, or if you're going to use statements of some kind, then also to do that. Again, think of the Goldilocks effect. Not too complex, but not too simple. somewhere in the middle, just right. It has to have the sufficient information for the person that's answering to really give you the information that you need. And as you're doing that, as you're writing your question, to really understand not just the question, but the sort of answers you're going to get and how you're going to process that information. So you have to think of everything as you're designing your needs analysis instrument. A second key insight here is to use multiple data collection methods for balance. Remember, depending on the sort of method that you use, you're going to get different insights. If you use a questionnaire, if you use an interview, if you use a self-test or self-assessment, if you're going to use an observation. These different methods will yield different sort of insights. Some will be more analytical in nature, some will be more qualitative in nature. It really depends on what you need. As an ESP course designer, that's the sort of method that you're generally going to be using. Another one here is to consider your TSA, PSA, and LACs form a complete picture. So it's not just about writing a random set of questions and just to kind of see what sticks and hopefully you get some good information out of that. No, it's really about understanding that for all of your potential learners, they currently can do something, but in fact, based on their job description, they need to do something else. Thus, they have a gap. There's a gap. And that gap is what the ESP course has to be about. So your questions should include or should address these three core items: your TSA, your PSA, and your LACs. And then in your analysis that comes after, you really attack that observation of, okay, what exactly is the gap here based on everything that I've gathered through my needs analysis instrument. Lastly here, your needs analysis instrument ensures courses are context relevant. Once again, and this is something that we've identified since the beginning of the course, that your ESP course has to be directly tied to the context, to the occupational context, to the academic context of your learners. So that means that your needs analysis instrument also needs to include, mention, and place those situations of the academic or occupational context. So that means that your questions need to address specifically by name things that you do in your job, things that you do in your academic scenario. It really depends if it's an accountant, if it's an engineer, if whatever the position is, you need to address it. You need to talk about it in your questions. Be specific about it, because that way, by continuously using that sort of vocabulary that refers to the job or the academics, then in turn, you include that also in your syllabus, in your course design. It always needs to be context relevant, always. Okay, so with these 4 key insights, we're going to wrap this up. And hopefully this will give you some more depth, some more understanding into the importance and the value of having a good and solid needs analysis instrument. All right, catch you next time.